On the East Coast, back in the mid-1800s, inspired by the beauty and serenity of Walden Pond, Henry David Thoreau shared his life philosophies about simple living in natural surroundings. There's probably no goal that a human being can achieve that's grander than Thoreau's admonition to live the life you've imagined. It's a challenge few are successful at, as the pressures and obligations of life pull us in nearly every direction except the one we really want to go. I'm David Wilson, and this week we continue our portrait of the character and characters of Mendocino wine. And our gigantic grape encounter in Mendocino County continues, and I'm so glad to have this next guest with me. Actually, I'm with him because I'm sitting in his winery, hence the echo that you hear. His name is Jim Milone, and I think it's appropriate to describe him as a winemaking maverick. Is that fair, Jim?
I guess that's probably a fair description, yes.
You don't care about the rules, right?
There ain't no rules. We just want it to taste good.
So the entity is Terra Savia.
Terra Savia is the name of our wine brand, yes.
I think we should start by translating.
Well, it means wise earth, and we kind of chose that name. We make organic wines and organic olive oils, and wise earth essentially relates to the fact that we are trying to make wise choices, and thus the Terra Savia.
Okay, now you've been in the business a very long time.
Long time. I've been making commercial wine for
Decades
35
here.
years, yeah.
And you were associated with Milano, right?
I started Milano Winery, co-founded Milano Winery with an old buddy of mine. We were about 19 when we started. We actually had to wait a couple of years to get bonded for obvious reasons.
Well, to get legal.
We weren't old enough to drink yet, but that was Greg Graziano. He and I were old school buddies.
Well, the exciting thing is I can relate to that because my brothers had fabricated a still long before they were drinking age. I was a beneficiary of that. I want to talk about the Italian connection here in this area. Mm-hmm. It seems like about 50% at least of the winemakers have an Italian connection. What's that about?
Well, a lot of our ancestors were drawn here from Italy because the climate was very similar to where they grew up. My great-grandfather was actually from northern Italy and had a winery here in Hopland before Prohibition. Actually, that winery was shut down during Prohibition. He got busted, and as the story goes, he headed for the hills. They busted up the winery, and there were no other wineries here in Hopland until I started Milano Winery in 1975.
Are you serious?
Seriously.
You were the first.
So we were the first winery to start after Prohibition in the area.
So you're growing organic grapes, making organic wines, but you've been doing that for a long time, even before it was fashionable.
I'm not a Davis graduate. I went to Humboldt State. I studied environmental science. So for me, when I came back from college and kind of did my own back to the earth movement, the way I decided to make wine happens to be organically. I didn't know that at the time.
Or maybe you just couldn't afford pesticides.
Well, that was another part of it, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, my father's generation, they were part of that whole, take this magic pill and it'll fix everything, farming generation, whereas my grandfather's generation farmed like we farm. They had the true symbiotic relationship within their vineyard, which I guess we have different terms for it now. But organic farming in his generation was not an option. That's just the way you did things.
But there's a lot that goes on in the vineyard well after the grapes are picked.
Absolutely. As I tell people, we start making wine in the late fall when we compost in the vineyards and when we plant cover crops and when we start to prune. You're actually starting to make wine right there because we actually grow what we consider the vineyard floor. We grow the soil, and then the vines flourish, and the vines will produce good quality fruit and with enhanced flavors. The only thing that we really, I think, give up by not farming conventionally is volume. We are not able to produce the same kind of volume on this particular
How much
acreage.
is your yield reduced by farming organically?
I would say 30%.
That much?
Yeah, easily.
Wow.
Easily. Some years more.
You need more dirt, that's all.
Yeah, exactly. Stack the dirt higher or something.
All right, let's talk olives for a second, because this is certainly a growing trend here in California. Mm-hmm. Winemakers planting olive trees because the seasons are not in conflict with one another.
Well, they're not. Only in the springtime, when it comes time for, in spring and winter, when it comes time for pruning and tilling and those kind of things, taking care of the trees and the vines. But in the fall, the olive harvest is usually right after the grape harvest.
So it keeps the workers working a little longer.
Well, yes, it does. And I think a lot of it is that same romantic attraction that attracts people to the wine business. It's similar with olives. It's hard to find an estate winery somewhere without a few olive trees planted. It just kind of seems like the next step.
It certainly seems to me that more and more people are really taking olive oil seriously.
Oh, absolutely. I think Americans' palates are starting to change and understand the difference in quality in olive oil. I know for me, once we started producing our own olive oil here, it was quite an eye-opener for me to taste this fresh olive oil. I'd always, I grew up, we ate olive oil out of 5-gallon cans, and it was just a standard. And then once I tasted the good stuff, now I'm pretty much ruined for the rest of my life.
I still have 5-gallon cans. But,
well, we do too.
But the thing is when I run out of wine, I usually just pour myself a glass of olive oil.
It's a great fit with wine, and of course, food. Wine and food. It's kind of the next step. It's a good fit.
All right, let's talk about the wines that you make. In fact, let's talk about wine and food for a second, because I've had many people, friends in the winemaking business, refer to their wines as being great food wines. And when somebody says food wine, to me, that means that I'm going to make a meal out of the bottle and forget, the steak or anything else.
Many wines become a meal. When I think people talk about wine going with food, it's a different style of wine that actually enhances food, like our sparkling wine, our Blanc de Blanc. It's very crisp. It's somewhat lemony, and it really does enhance things like lobster bisque or caviar, fatty, béarnaise sauce type things. And so it has that nice contrast. Whereas some bottles of red wine, or maybe a very heavily made Chardonnay that has a lot of malolactic, many times is a meal in itself.
What drives your winemaking design decisions? Is it the food or is it the wine?
It's the wine. I really do not make wines to pair with food specifically. Some of them do very well, but I don't make wine thinking, I'm going to do this to it so it'll go better with a steak.
So you don't go,
lobster.
My mom used to make this great brisket and I'm going to make a wine to go with that.
No. I try to take each wine and make it the best that it can be, to, steal a phrase. I think every wine has a certain potential, and I think if you try to put a square peg in a round hole, that's how you end up with wines that are kind of funky.
And I'm going to guess that you make your wines for you.
I do. I make wines that I like to drink, and what's really dictated my style is I made a whole bunch of over-extracted wines back in the early 80s that are just terrible. They were great when they were young, and in my cellar they just fell apart. So what's really changed my style as a winemaker is I've learned that, and I hate to admit, but I have to give some credit to our French friends, that, wines with finesse, a little lighter style, definitely age better. And, being older now, I can appreciate a wine that's had some age. When I was a young winemaker back in the mid-late 70s, we didn't have access to a lot of old wines.
But if you talk to most winemakers now, I think they will tell you that they really don't make wines to lay down so much anymore, that, wines are made to drink now.
Well,
I hear that more and more and more.
I think it depends on how you sell your wine. And if you're, in an extreme commercial situation, you have to make wines that will drink well early, because most wines in this country are consumed early. Depending on your situation, if you're in a situation where you can make wines that you can afford to lay down, then that would dictate your style a bit also. But I also have, another one of my little pet theories, that from my experience, the wines that I've made that aged well were actually approachable early as well. So I don't necessarily think that wine has to be old to be approachable. Good wine, the best wines that I've made were good when they were young, and they're still good.
See, that's like me. I was good when I was young. I just am a lot better now. It's just so that I creak when I get up now. And
more finesse.
Exactly.
But I call that finesse now. I move slower, so I just tell my wife, that's finesse. No more bull in the china shop.
We're going to continue our conversation with Jim Milone of Terra Savia Wines, but I must say you are never too old to spend a little time out on Catalina Island, which to my knowledge is one of the very few islands where you can find a vineyard. And oh, what a sight for sore eyes that is. So really, there are two destinations you need to put on your bucket list: Mendocino Wine Country and Catalina Island. And to get to Catalina, take the fast, economical, and very comfortable Catalina Express. The Catalina Express has multiple daily departures out of San Pedro, Long Beach, and Dana Point. You can see their fall schedule and purchase tickets online at CatalinaExpress.com. And don't forget, travel for free aboard the Catalina Express on your birthday. No kidding. All you have to do is register online at CatalinaExpress.com. That's a hard one to beat. Another thing that's really tough to beat is the amazing wine at Terra Savia in Mendocino County. And we're fortunate to be able to sample this organic winemaking artistry today here on Grape Encounters Radio. Jim Milone, director of wine sales, but really the grand poobah of Terra Savia. And Terra Savia can be found online?
We are online. We do have a web presence with our website, and we're widely distributed in Whole Foods in California.
That's quite an honor, huh?
It is. It didn't happen easily. Took a little legwork on my part. But yes, it's been very nice having that market presence.
You know, it's interesting about the markets like Whole Foods. It seems to me like about 5-10 years ago, you would go in and you would see the organic wines, but there would be the same wine, and there would be like 10 bottles all horizontally next to each other.
Right.
And now it's starting to narrow where it's like a regular wine store or a big supermarket now. They try to stretch it out to make it look like a lot of wine, but it really wasn't at all.
Well, they have more options now, and I think the organic segment has just gotten better and better.
Any desire to go biodynamic?
Biodynamic to me is, and that was kind of the word I was looking for when I was talking about the way my grandfather farmed. My grandfather had the true definition of a biodynamic farm, which was one symbiotic unit. There are very few people that can do that. That's very, very difficult. And even for us, as dedicated as we are to that idea, and even though we have pretty much a closed system, it's almost impossible these days to only use things that come from your own farm. So we do that as much as possible. But as far as being certified biodynamic, no.
There's a lot that goes into that.
There is.
And you have to have a very open mind.
Absolutely.
All right, so last question. You go to the Central Coast. I know that when I taste Central Coast wines, I can generally recognize them. I can tell the difference between a Central Coast Pinot and an Oregon Pinot, for instance. Mm-hmm. I can tell the difference, I think, between Napa wines and Mendocino wines. They're different characteristics. What do you have that these other areas don't? What do you have on them, and what do they have on you?
Oh, gosh, I don't know. It's hard when you put it in that context. I think the biggest variation is geography, because you can find within each of those regions, subregions or microclimates that are very similar. I think you can find wines in Calistoga that are very similar to Hopland. I think you can find wines in Carneros that are very similar to the Anderson Valley. So I think it has more to do with microclimates than really counties or broader regions. So I don't think anybody really has anything naturally an advantage as far as microclimate or geography, but I think that there are regions that have maybe a one-up as far as marketing and have had wineries there longer, bigger, more serious producers. So I think, and part of our history in Mendocino is that we have this Italian heritage that you're talking about and more farmer wines. And I think other areas maybe have had more sophisticated wine producers in their regions longer.
It's an interesting point, Napa. The farmer wines, family-made wines. Yeah. There's a different style to them altogether.
Right. But they're sort of coming into fashion because it's the personality of wine that I think is starting to make us more popular.
But the person who's hearing us on a podcast in Poughkeepsie, what would you tell them would be the reason for them to look for Mendocino wines?
Most Mendocino wines are very personal. There is generally a person like myself that's behind that wine. Whether you go back to the past generation of John Parducci or my generation, there's usually somebody who is a driving force that's very close to those wines. We're not corporate.
I always tell people that if you learn something about the person who made the wine, you'll like the wine better.
Oh, absolutely. That's the fun of it.
Unless it's a real jerk of a winemaker.
Well, there you go.
There are a few of those out there.
Yeah, and then it's a drag when they make good wine, All
right. Jim Milone, winemaker of Terra Savia in Hopland, California, in beautiful Mendocino County. It's the trailing edge of the California wine country, but an area that you should not overlook. They don't get as much publicity, but they certainly get a good product to market, and more Grape Encounters coming your way.